Live from the chicken wing capital of the world, Buffalo, New York. You're listening to the Childcare Bridge Podcast, your source for the best tips, tools, and tactics on how to market and grow your childcare center, ensuring total domination. Total domination. This is the Childcare Bridge, and this is your host, Michael Tasner.
Hey there, and welcome to Ep004. In today's episode, I'm going to piggyback off of the conversation in the last episode. And in that episode, I was talking about the reasons that you might not want to get into the childcare industry. What are some of the things that are tripping childcare center owners up on a regular basis? But the topic that I really wanted to hit head on in today's episode, because I continue to see this being asked, and more so, I continue to see this being mentioned between the statistics and things in the media and really boots on the ground of just hearing things through Facebook groups and such. And that topic is closing your center or multiple. What is the biggest reason, or what are two or three of the big reasons that are causing people to make that really tough? So I'm going to shed some light, and I'm going to shed some light based on firsthand knowledge. And in coming episodes, I'm actually going to bring people onto the show that decided to close their center, or they decided to sell it and move on and do something else, or even potentially retire. And I want to shed that light so that you can hear right from their mouths, but more so just to be able to kind of interact and ask some additional questions that might be more specific to your individual situation. So a couple of disclaimers. First one is every situation is different. Like, you have to be making decisions that are best for you and your family and your future. So I don't want you to assume just because I'm saying here are the two or three biggest reasons, and if you're like, well, one of those three is me, I guess it's time to close the doors, that doesn't mean that's the decision that's going to make the most sense for you, your business, your family, your future, and everything going forward. But I also, more importantly, want you to at least start to glean some of these insights so that if you start to see some of these things slipping, if you start to see some of these things moving in that direction, you can pause and say, well, geez, if these are some of the things that are literally putting other centers of business, or literally forcing owners to want to just close their doors and not even sell and literally just walk away, then I better pause. So before I get into those trends, there's something that I have realized way back when in this industry. And that is, most of the people that are listening, you're very, very good with kids. You're very, very good with the curriculum side of things and interacting with parents. But you didn't necessarily go to school and learn all of the other stuff that comes with running and owning a business. And I personally have been there. You didn't go to school to learn about operations and reading a P&L and a balance sheet and just all of the stuff, the marketing, the selling. Like, you actually do have to close enrollments and have tours that drive people to take action. Like, you didn't go to school for all that stuff. And a lot of people learn it through the school of hard knocks, as people like to say. But unless you start to nail down some of those business fundamentals, there's going to be a lot of challenges that keep kind of smacking you down as you gain some momentum. Well, geez, now I need to better understand human resources and how to deal with that kinds of stuff. And now as they're opening another location, I've got to better understand marketing and sales and customer acquisition cost and just all of those things. Like, it's complicated stuff. Like, if business in general were easy, nobody would be working for anyone else. You literally would just have your own, everyone would have their own business. So I don't want you to fret and be like, oh my God, that Michael's saying this stuff is just so complicated. But there are going to be certain things that I'm going to train you and teach you and mentor you on in all the future episodes that you have to take and then execute on that and build on those skills. You have to build on it. You have to at least put those kind of pieces of the puzzle in so that you're not constantly running, well, there's 4 or 5 pieces that are missing this week, and now we're running into all these issues. But there's an asterisk and there's a silver lining. and it's one of my favorite phrases that an earlier mentor of mine used to say. His name was Adam Whitty. He runs the company called Advantage Group. And he would say, if you have no problems, you have no business. And I have repeated that phrase to my team and to lots of other people. Like, there's always going to be problems in business. If you have a business that's literally operating without any problems, you really don't have. So, brass tacks. What are the biggest reasons that childcare centers are starting to close? And I'm going to start with the one that's the most obvious, and that is cash. Running a center, growing a center, cash flow management, putting money aside for taxes, it is very, very challenging. So ultimately, in the end, and I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of businesses, not just in this industry, but other industries, on this exact topic of why did they end up closing or going out of business or going bankrupt. Actually finishing a really great book about this. And ultimately, it's cash. You look at the numbers and you say, well, last year we did, and I'm just going to make up some numbers here, we did $1 million in sales and revenue. I paid myself a $40,000 salary, and we ended up with $6,000 in profit. You're like, okay, well, after paying taxes on your salary, like, you ended up working for less than minimum wage. And then you start to look at how many hours you put in, and you just start to question, is it worth it? The other side is when you're starting out, you're having to absorb a lot of those expenses in the beginning. So if you're acquiring a location, if you're buying the real estate, you have to have money to put down. Like, you're not putting down $5,000. In some cases, you're having to put down a couple $100,000. And then when you get into the center, you realize, well, geez, I probably need another $100,000, and I just put it all down in the building. And then you already are starting behind the eight ball, where you're then having to rob Peter to pay Paul, and you're having to borrow more money from friends and family, or you take money out of your 401k that you had stocked aside, and you really get behind very, very quickly. The cash side of this business, the profit side, can be very, very challenging. And ultimately, that's a lot of the reason why many centers are deciding to just close their doors, or they're trying to sell, and then they're recouping at least their real estate. If they're not charging the tuition, for example, that they should be charging, and then all of a sudden you're looking at these numbers and they're just really not adding up. So a lot of the centers that I've talked to, when I've asked the question of what made you decide to close your doors, what made you decide to just retire early, for example, like, why? What was that thing that put you over the edge? And they'll say, Michael, the money just wasn't there. We weren't making any money. Now, the good news with everything is that every challenge has opportunities and has solutions. And I will touch on those a little bit in this episode, but they're going to make up entire episodes as we go forward. So with cash, it's accurately and effectively monitoring not just your cash, but your balance sheet, your profit and loss statement, and spending a couple hours every single month. And then being able to be proactive, being able to do forecasting to see if you generate X enrollments, what does that mean by way of more expenses? Because you need to make sure that you're within ratios. So you might have to hire someone else. But then what does it mean to your bottom line? Great, if we hire another 3 teachers, we fill those enrollments, but we know that it's going to take some time. We're going to need some marketing money. So it's actually thinking all the different steps through, where it's not just willy-nilly forecasting. Great, we're going to be at 70 enrollments over the summer, then we're going to get up to 110. Our capacity is 30. Like, you're not just willy-nilly throwing things in. The numbers side of this is among the most important pieces. The other piece to this is you want to make sure that you're not practicing this whole cash in the bank is kind of gauging where things are. So you log in, great, there's $100,000 sitting in the bank account. I'm rich. And then 2 weeks later, well, you didn't realize you had to pay all these taxes out, and now you've got $20,000, now you feel poor. Like, you have to make sure that you're effectively managing all that stuff. You have the different buckets, etc. We'll talk about profit first in future episodes and a lot more on the financial side. But the number one reason that centers are closing is they're not making enough profit for it to make sense, or they're bleeding cash. There's a lot of centers that have approached us to help them from a marketing standpoint. And also, well, what's your marketing budget? Well, last month we lost $25,000, so our budget's zero. That's close to an impossible situation, because then you're also operating in a pretty tough mindset. But if you get behind the eight ball early, it's tough to catch up in this particular industry. Then you're taking on on all of these extra loans and borrow more money, and it just becomes very, very difficult to catch up. So you have to make sure that you're effectively managing the money. The other thing from a cash standpoint is a lot of centers are closing because they took out lots of money that they got from the government, and not everything is taxed, but all this stuff is taxed. So simple math, if you get $100,000 in money, and that's free money, but you're going to have to pay the taxes on that as income, and let's say that's going to be $25,000, and you spend not only the $100,000, but you spend another $25,000. Tax time comes, and great, so you owe $40,000 in taxes across your stuff, and the money that, like, well, geez, not only do I not have that, I spent even more. And then now you're really behind the eight ball once again. You're having to play heavy catch up, and you're having to get into agreements with the government on tax repayment plans. Like, it's tough. And this is not just this particular industry. Like, this is across many, many industries. But cash has been the biggest thing that has been putting centers to close, putting centers out of business and having centers make that decision. The one that kind of goes along with cash, but not necessarily, is the competition side. There's the growing trend of public schools, for example, offering free pre-K, for example. How do you compete with free if you were charging $1,000 a month and it's free at this center or at this school, for example? Now, there are going to be different ways to compete if you've got different offerings and you're an academy or Reggio Emilia or Montessori, and maybe that school is a traditional daycare, for example. But if you're a traditional daycare and you're in a district that all of a sudden rolls out everything being completely free at the school, and there's no longer any grants or subsidies coming to you, that's really, really tough. There's also a lot of growing competition with these big box franchises. If you look at some of them, Goddard, Primrose, Kids Are Kids, for example, they're still opening up centers. There's a lot of small brands that are starting to open up more and more aggressively, and they're getting scrappy. There are some franchises that are opening up in strip malls. So all of a sudden, maybe you were one of the only games in town, or there was one or two other centers, but now there's 8 centers, and the population of kids did not change. Now, if you're not adjusting your marketing spend, if you're not getting more aggressive, you start to run into challenges. So the competition side is one that I'm hearing day in and day out. Now, this isn't from every center, because you can go 50 miles one direction or 20 miles a different direction, and you could tell me the exact opposite. So that's why I started at the beginning of this episode and said it's really on a case by case. But I'm giving you these tidbits so that if you start to see certain things, or you start to read about, well, they're getting ready to offer free pre-K, that if you know that well in advance, you can start to mitigate, you can start to combat those, you can plan. But a lot of these things, it ends up being too late if you ignore some of these things that are happening in the industry. If I go back to cash, there was an article that was just published like a week ago before shooting this episode, and it was talking exactly about all of this funding during COVID that was being dealt out, and that dried up. And if you were counting on all of that to completely fund your business, again, there's no cash. Like, it doesn't make sense to be running the business if you're making no money and or losing money. So all of those extra subsidies, if those start to dry up, and they have been drying up, that also really ends up being a challenge. So we talked about cash, we talked about growing competition. There's 2 more that I want to touch on. Third one really is just burnout. And in this industry, burnout is a lot more common. And maybe you say, well, Michael, I get it. It makes complete sense to me. I saw it way back when, but I didn't think that it would get to this point where people that have had centers for 20, 30, 40 years that were going to pass them down to their kids are just like, no, I'm done. This is enough. I've had enough. But I think with everything just kind of compounding, and that really is the issue. It's that compound effect of a lot of little to medium-sized problems and compound. And now you've got in one basket, you've got all the cash challenges. All of this free government money starts to run out. You're having to pay back a lot of this stuff in taxes that maybe you didn't plan for. All the fears and such of what's to come, changing economy. So parents are financially getting tighter and tighter. So you're like, I need to raise rates, and people are asking me to reduce rates. So all that cash stuff, negative feedback from parents. And then the final one that we're going to talk about in a second is everyone's least favorite, and that's all things staffing and hiring in this industry right now. And that has been one of the biggest biggest, if not the biggest, right after cash. But you get all those things of, well, we're having trouble hiring a director and hiring teachers. So like, this is enough. I've had enough. The challenge with being burned out is that this is not one of those things that just hits you overnight. Like, there are many days that I feel burned out. Like, I've been in the digital marketing industry since I was 15 years old. I turned 40 March of 2024. Like, I've literally been grinding in the digital marketing space for 5 years. Think about that. I'm like that's crazy. And my first business was an agency that I grew and sold. Sounds fancier than it really was. The reason that I sold it was that I was burned out. I was working 100 hours a week. I had financial issues, wasn't managing the money correctly. Like, I was doing all of the things, staffing issues, all the things wrong that I'm talking about in this episode. So I've been there, I've done that. And I'm seeing it happening more now with centers than I've ever seen before. Center owners that are exhausted. So you have to start to realize and see some of these things occurring in your life. You need to spot the trends and start, oh, wait a second here. Like, this is starting to happen. And you need to then put a couple of items in place to make sure that it doesn't also happen to you. Because once you start resenting your business for more than a couple of weeks at a time, your energy, you bring in that negative energy to your team. They get negative. A couple more people end up quitting because of the negativity and the culture. Then you're back into, oh my gosh, you got all these staffing issues. Like, it's a merry-go-round cycle. You need to build a place, a center, a business that can operate without you. And we're going to talk a lot about the entrepreneurial operating system. And I'm going to give you what I call the childcare operating system. So different buckets and pieces that you can then put in place to help mitigate, to help allow you to step away, to have it where you don't have to be working 70, 80, 90 hours a week, so that you can be fresh, you can be peppy, you can be engaged and happy with your center. And the last one I'm going to end with is staffing. And the crazy thing with this is that, similar to competition, where I can go 20 miles in one direction and show you tons of competition, and then another 20 miles and show you that there's no centers and that you could open 4 more locations and fill all of them without having to do a ton of marketing. Staffing is the same thing. I'm seeing some centers that we are able to help get staffed up very rapidly, and then other centers where we're not able to get those resumes. The good news with staffing is that there are 2 or 3 easy things that you can do to solve this problem. The first one is you have to understand that right now, the number one motivator is money. Never used to be money. But when economies are poor, money and survival, like, we literally need to survive. If you don't have enough money, why would I take a job for $15 when I could go work at another center for $22 an hour that's down the street? $7 more an hour, for example. You need to make sure that your wages are not only competitive, that if you want to have more resumes, you want to hire faster, you want to keep good people, you need to be paying more than everybody else. Plain and simple. Now, you could debate this with me all day long. And are you going to find some diamonds in a rough that they do it for the love of kids? 100%. But those are the 5 to 10% maybe. The way to attract more talent right now is, if you were paying $15 an hour, you've now got to be paying 18, 20, 22, even more. And you're, Michael, how do we afford this? Well, you go back to number 1 of the cash side of forecasting all this stuff out, looking at where you can actually put your tuition levels, looking at what other ways you can generate additional capital, summer camp, after school, before school, other activities, partnering with different organizations. There's lots of other ways to generate cash and income for your center. But if you're talking about a few $100s a month, let's even call it $500 a month. But if that one teacher can take on 8 enrollments, 6, 10, whatever the magic ratio is for the age of your location, there's a lot of lost opportunity there that you're not thinking through. You're just, well, I can't afford it. That's what I've always been doing. You've got to forecast, run the numbers, and see where you can actually be. So if you want to solve the staffing thing that is literally driving most of these centers to close, well, there's no one's out there. There's still people looking for jobs, but they want more money. They want a better work-life balance. They want a good culture at the center. They want some other fringe benefits that people are now starting to offer. So look at what you can do to literally be 50 to 100% better than all the other centers around you. If the average center is offering 15 to 17 an hour, I want you to be coming in at 20, even a little bit higher. And that might mean then you've got to update all of your team's wages. So this is a whole big thing. It's going to open up a little bit of Pandora's box as you start to go down this path. But I promise you that if the staffing side doesn't get handled over the next 6 months, it's going to be very, very difficult to catch up and get back into a better spot. So this episode was not meant to be doom and gloom. This episode was not meant to say every center is closing, because the good news is we're working with hundreds and hundreds of centers all day, every day that are thriving. A lot of our centers that we're working with are having their best years ever, because what they're doing is they're starting to find the centers that were poorly managed, and they're starting to acquire them and rebuild them and ran them and get them back into a good spot, and they're buying them for pennies on the dollar. So I don't want you to be one of those statistics. Stick with the content, stick with this podcast. I promise you, we will help to get your center turned around. We'll help to get you to a point where you're acquiring other locations. You're building the brand that you've always wanted. You're making that impact that you've always desired. Thank you as always for tuning in. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. See ya.